This is the most realistic wilderness survival challenge I have seen. 8 amateurs were left in the wilderness of Sarselv Lake within the Arctic Circle. Other than basic supplies provided by the crew, challengers were not allowed to bring any tools or food. The last person standing could win a $500,000 prize. MADS was lucky to qualify for the competition. Before the boat even docked, he eagerly threw his smelly shoes ashore and began his journey to victory barefoot. At 26, he was already a meditation instructor with a steadfast routine of meditating for 3 hours each morning. He trained outdoors for 6 months to prepare for this challenge. After setting up a simple tent, he started looking for food. After scanning the shore, he stripped, grabbed a fishing net, and headed for the deep water. The next contestant, Trine, a 32-year-old adventure instructor from a boarding school, loved thrilling outdoor activities. She joined the challenge to boast in front of her students. Back to Mads, he was now fishing naked. The local fish were delicious, especially the trout with their high-fat content. He skillfully cleaned, chopped, and cooked them, adding some gathered mushrooms before cooking, which unexpectedly discolored the dish, turning it into a culinary disaster. Trine managed to catch a fish barehanded by the lake. Though small, she was grateful. She carefully prepared and cooked the fish, using part of it to make soup, making sure no part was wasted. The meal was satisfying and gave her the energy to start building a shelter with wood. However, she soon became hungry again and tried her luck with a fishing net at the lake, though casting it was challenging due to her height. Her shelter turned out to be quite luxurious, built with double-layered logs and insulated with moss for fireproofing and heat insulation. It was spacious and well-supplied. Another contestant, Mette, an outdoor guide who owned her company, joined the contest to promote her business. Fleming, seen messing with an oil drum, turned it into a raft with a couple of sticks. A falconer by profession, he once boasted of killing a bear and eating its heart raw to gain the bear's strength. He is surely the champion of this season. He dragged the raft down, and then he began to cut open his moisture-proof mat. The mat was cut and tied to the 4 corners of the raft. With a fishing net in hand, he rowed the raft to the deep water. Next up was Henrik P., who saw a soaring eagle as soon as he landed. He took it as a good omen, believing it meant he would win. He is a civil engineer who enjoys studying various oddities. Though only in his 50s, he already has 2 grandchildren. His goal in joining the contest is to become a superhero grandfather. He chose to settle on a rocky cliff, tying a rope to a stick and wedging it into a crack in the rock. He then secured the other end of the rope to a tree and finally covered it with a waterproof cloth. Though it was drafty on 3 sides, at least it had a backrest and a roof. It was enough to withstand winds and rain for a while. Mads has been dizzy and nauseous since eating that pot of fish. He tossed and turned in bed, unable to sleep. Despite trying to gather some firewood, he nearly fainted. By evening, his condition had not improved. It's uncertain if he can make it through the night. This is the first time I've seen someone destroy their equipment in many seasons of wilderness living. This eccentric contestant is named Henrik D. He is a vegetarian, 39 years old, with a happy family of 4. To prepare for the competition, he underwent 7 days of fasting. He believes that nature's gifts can support him to win the competition without taking the lives of other animals. He even threw the fishing gear provided by the crew directly into the fire. The next challenger, Rasmus, was lucky to catch a fish. Still, he was happy as it proved there were fish around. However, he became frustrated when he accidentally cut a big hole in the fishing net while cleaning and tying it. Angry, he threw the net on the ground and left the sad shore. He is a heavy motorcycle rider who longs for a free life. Usually keen on social activities, being alone now is somewhat difficult for him. He found a stick and immediately treasured it, entered the jungle hoping to find a place to build a shelter. But the area was just a damp marshland, so he had to look again towards the distant beach. After scavenging, he found some wood, made an A-frame, covered it with a waterproof cloth, and then secured it with stones around it. This little yellow hat, named Sune, was moved to tears upon arriving. At 41, he is a truck driver who grew up by the sea with a family obsessed with fishing. Confident in his ancestral fishing skills, he believes he can last until the end. To encourage him, his mother specially knitted a sweater for him, embroidering his name on it, symbolizing that his family is with him. Upon landing, I saw many footprints on the beach. Although excited, my thoughts remained clear. I quickly built a large tripod, only to realize the waterproof cloth was too small when I tried to lay it. It looked like I would have to dismantle and rebuild it unexpectedly. While others were still worrying about food, Fleming had already started looking for a place to raise fish. Ever since making a raft from an oil drum, he has never been idle. He cleaned the fish right by the shore, deliberately keeping the innards to use as bait. After wrapping them in the waterproof cloth, he buried them in a hole to keep them fresh and protect against mosquitoes and insects. He didn't forget to place 2 sticks as markers. Then he found a small stream in the jungle and submerged the bag containing the fish, hanging from a branch into the water. This natural fridge kept the fish from spoiling. After finishing these tasks, it was time to happily eat. Looking at the 3 big pots full of fish, Henrik P's days seemed quite miserable in comparison. He had been sleepless since arriving 4 days ago. Just looking at his despondent expression, you could tell how uncomfortable he was. His frustration grew when the fishing net yielded nothing. In a moment of anger, he fell over. He got up, adjusted his mood, and prepared to move the net to deeper waters. Trine's situation also looked grim. She had only eaten a small fish over these days. She swore that if she didn't catch a fish today, she would go home. While retrieving her net, she prayed for divine mercy. Perhaps it was fate or maybe the crew's doing, but there was a dead fish in her net. After returning home, she eagerly prepared it. After filling her stomach, she decided to use the innards for fishing. However, her choice of fishing spot wasn't great. Her first cast got snagged at the bottom. After struggling fruitlessly, she cleanly cut the line and replaced the hook to continue fishing. But then it got tangled in a branch. She persisted until sunset with no catch and returned to the shelter, doubting her survival skills for the first time. On the 5th day, Fleming woke up and rushed to the shore to check the fishing lines he had set the night before. The moment he pulled up the line, he felt a fish on the hook. After some frantic effort, he managed to drag a slippery eel ashore. Although it wasn't big, it would make a nice breakfast soup. Sune finally had his moment of glory. When he pulled up the fishing net, he felt its heavy weight. A huge codfish was among the 3 large fish he caught, finally allowing for a hearty meal. He quickly slaughtered and cleaned them. Henrik P's breakfast was still boiled berries. The more he ate, the more he felt life was too bitter. Hungry and sleep-deprived, he became gaunt. After deceiving his stomach, he decided to build himself a comfort nest. He tied the ends of the waterproof cloth with ropes and then tied it between 2 large trees to make a simple hammock. He carefully shifted his buttocks onto it and only lay down once he felt stable. After adjusting to the best position, he felt extremely comfortable. It had been a few days since we last saw Henrik D., who had built a large A-frame house and just needed to cut out a smoke vent to finish it. He sat inside, admiring his handiwork. Meta seems to be the most steadily progressing at the moment. She was devouring a fish and mentioned how hard it was to catch. After replenishing her energy, she started to chop wood. Deciding to build a dock for fishing in deeper waters, she first constructed a tripod and embedded it in the water. Then she dragged several thick, long logs onto it, completing the simple dock. After casting her fishing net into the deeper waters, she gave us a tour of her luxurious home. All her tools hung on the back wall, opposite her solid wood bed, topped with a sleeping bag. Moss sealed all 4 walls, adding a layer of waterproof cloth for moisture resistance and warmth. Trine braved the rain to check her catch by the lake. She could vaguely see the shadow of fish as she prayed while pulling in the net. Despite her efforts, she couldn't haul the net ashore, completely losing her composure. Meanwhile, Henrik P's roof was leaking profusely. Rainwater streamed down the rock face, nearly washing him away. He had to remove the waterproof cloth and search for a new campsite, carrying his belongings for a long time until he found a sheltered, flat area. He tied the waterproof cloth between 2 large trees, constructing a temporary shelter to get through the night. Fleming was always satisfied with his dwelling, located behind a hill beside a water source filled with an inexhaustible supply of fish. However, water from the hill was inadvertently flooding his house. He intended to dig a drainage ditch to divert the rainwater, but the hard ground soon discouraged him. With no other choice, he used 2 wooden sticks to prop up the waterproof cloth, completely enclosing his shelter. Meta was the only one unaffected by the storm. After it stopped, she went to check today's catch, but perhaps influenced by the weather, her fishing net was empty. Sune was also checking his fishing net, when he was shocked to see the small stream had turned into a large waterfall. The net he placed by the stream had been swept far away. He tried to pull it back, using all his strength, but it didn't budge, firmly stuck at the bottom of the lake. Frustrated, he cursed loudly as he left the disheartening sight. Suddenly, a boat from the crew appeared, stirring up water. It turned out Trine was waiting on the shore, expressing she was too hungry to continue even a minute longer. The lack of fish completely shattered her confidence. Once again, Meta turned the survival challenge into a wilderness gourmet show, presenting smoked fish with a golden hue, garnished with vegetables and berries, not only nutritious and balanced, but also visually comparable to a high-end restaurant. Meta said she has a unique method for roasting fish. She cleans the salmon, skewers it on a branch, and hangs it above the fireplace. When the fire is strong enough, she covers it with fresh pine branches. After eating, Meta starts sawing wood again. She says the unpredictable weather here makes her feel secure only with enough stored firewood. After storing the firewood, she insulates her cabin by carefully filling every gap with moss. For added comfort, she collects a large amount of spruce branches to create a green natural carpet for her cabin floor. A sudden heavy rain soaked Mads through. To keep working, he wrapped a waterproof cloth around his lower body. Considering the poor fishing yields recently, he decided to build a boat to try fishing in deeper waters. He chopped many spruce branches, cleared the excess twigs, and wove them into a ring shape. He then used 2 branches to form a cross at the bottom for support and wrapped it all in waterproof cloth. This raft was completed and carefully launched into the water. Surprisingly, it floated on the waves, and the successful trial boosted his confidence in winning the $500,000 prize. Fleming is probably the wealthiest so far, with 2 trout and 5 eels in his bag. To preserve the food, he built a platform in the water and tied the bag with the fish to it, using the cold lake water to keep the fish fresh. Back at the shelter, he took out his family's photo, found a spot to hang it, and walked to the back hill to alleviate his homesickness by enjoying the beautiful scenery and rare tranquility. At that moment, 2 beautiful rainbows appeared in the sky, a good omen for him. Suna must be really bored to film a mosquito eating breakfast. He waited for the mosquito to finish before setting off to find food. His fishing net had been carried away by a flood 2 days ago. With some sunlight now, he hurried to retrieve it, diving into the water naked to avoid getting his clothes wet. Despite several attempts and changing breaths in the cold lake water, he couldn't find the net. Without a net, he had no source of food. After much thought, he finally took out his last fishing net, carefully placing it in the water, making sure not to make any more mistakes. On day 11, Rasmus's fishing net finally caught 2 small fish, but at the cost of tearing the net. After returning to the shelter, he immediately began repairing the net, as fish is his only source of food, and he couldn't afford to lose it. This was the biggest fish Soon had caught. He picked up a stone and swiftly ended its life. This head must weigh at least 10 pounds. He was so happy that he held the fish and did a dance. After returning to the shelter and intending to start a fire for cooking, sudden hail began to fall from the sky, making it impossible to start the fire. To get a stable and long-lasting fire source in the rain outdoors, you need to carefully learn Henrik P's technique. First, he cut 3 logs to use as chopping blocks. Then, he carved the sticks into feather shapes to expose the dry inner parts. After lighting the campfire, he placed some damp branches on top. Slowly, the flames began to ignite the inner parts of the logs. This method of burning not only produces high temperatures, but also lasts longer. The camera then switches to Mads, who is dejectedly squatting by the shore, staring at his raft. It turns out that during a previous test, the raft was punctured by sharp spruce trees. After brief contemplation, he decided to replace it with the waterproof cloth from the roof. He couldn't give up on the boat. It was his hope for winning the competition. Meanwhile, Rasmus is airing out his clothes. Last night's rain completely flooded his cabin, turning not only the floor into a swamp, but also the fireplace into a puddle. He had to find a new camping spot. After walking around, he decided to build a beachfront villa. He chopped down several large trees and erected a tripod. It took all day to construct the frame, and by nightfall, he laid down waterproof cloth to serve as a temporary shelter. The next day, he found a tree root that looked remarkably like a dinosaur. Then he went to check his fishing net, 5 days since his last meal. Unfortunately, the net was empty again today. He regretted eating the fish he caught last time all at once. If he had saved a fish head, he could have made some soup now. The more he thought about it, the more dissatisfied he became. To satiate his hunger, he went to pick up the remains he had discarded earlier. Although they were a bit smelly, they could still be eaten after boiling. Watching him eat, we hope he doesn't get diarrhea. Everyone else was busy while Henrik D. lazily stayed in bed, believing that rainy days are best spent sleeping, convinced that he would wake up to sunshine. This was Meta's second time stripping and entering the cold lake. Earlier, when checking the net, she found it stuck at the bottom of the lake. To ensure she didn't tear it with too much force, she had to dive in herself to retrieve it. Though it took a lot of effort and the net was retrieved, it was empty, and she nearly got hypothermia. So she quickly drove 3 stakes next to the fire, covered them with waterproof cloth to make a foot bath, poured in hot water, and comfortably soaked her feet by the fire. But as she looked at the icy lake, she couldn't help feeling melancholic. With the weather getting colder and food supplies dwindling, she wondered how much longer she could last. Rasmus, across the lake, worked hard to catch fish. He fixed one end of his fishing net to a rock on the shore and tied the other end to a piece of wood. Stripping off his clothes, he pushed the stake into the deeper water. After setting the net, he sat by the lake with a pot, waiting. This wait lasted until the next day, when he found 2 fish in the net, filling him with instant joy. He was moved to tears by his rich haul. To his surprise, another big fish hung in a second net. The sight of these 3 fish was incredibly motivating. Sune also had a good catch today. Arriving at the lake, he immediately encountered a pleasant surprise. These fish gave him the energy to speed up the shelter repairs. He built a triangular structure with ample space inside for all his belongings, solving his housing issue. With a stable food source, he believed he could stay until Christmas. However, in the following days, he only caught a small fish that was hardly enough to fill the gaps between his teeth. After some thought, he decided to build a raft to fish in deeper waters. He sawed some wood to make a frame and tightly tied the corners with rope. Then he attached waterproof fabric and prepared for a test sail. Speaking of boat building, Mads had been busy. After several days, he repaired the holes in the waterproof fabric and reinforced the base supports. He then covered it with spruce branches for flotation, reviving his raft. To equip the boat with a paddle, he wrapped a piece of waterproof fabric around a stick. After using many materials, his boat was ready for a test. He eagerly started fishing, fixing one end of the net to a branch on the shore and rowing to deeper waters with the other end. Everything went smoothly, and now catching fish depended on luck. Meanwhile, Suna's makeshift raft was being tested. He used a stick as a paddle and set off, but the boat sank as soon as he stepped on it. Meta hadn't caught any fish for 3 days and began to panic, suspecting there might be a problem with the net. She took it home for maintenance, and then tried casting a fishing line from the shore, obviously a novice by her technique. While waiting, she began marking time on her walking stick. Mads's net was full of fish, too many to count with both hands. Delighted, he returned to his shelter to start grilling the largest one. On the 16th day of the competition, the weather on the island began to change. To protect against the impending storm, Rasmus decided to make a windbreak. He set up a horizontal beam between 2 large trees, placed a wooden stick on top, and filled it with leaves to create a slanted baffle. Fleming also rushed to finish his last wall. Compared to the sturdy and attractive wall, Mads's cabin was noticeably inferior. However, Fleming carefully installed some drainage pipes, ensuring he wouldn't flood during rain. Henrik P., worried about a large tree falling and crushing his shelter, exerted tremendous effort to saw down the tree at his door. That night, the storm indeed swept through the island. The next morning, the mountain was a mess, with large spruce trees uprooted. Sune, invigorated, went to check his fishing nets. He caught what might be the largest fish of the season, and was so thrilled he couldn't let go. However, this also came at a cost. The net had a big hole. Despite his attempts to repair it, he was powerless to fix it properly, and sat by the shore, lamenting that his joy was too short-lived. Knowing this was his last fishing net, he decided to quit the race after a night of contemplation. Reluctantly, he took one last look at the beautiful place and started his journey home. After Suna's departure, on the 19th day, Fleming took his raft to check the fishing nets. He was finally able to catch a big fish, satisfyingly securing it in his bag. Soon after, he caught another, and then a third, smiling broadly. Fleming, thinking 2 was already good, was delighted with 3. After dispatching the fish, he returned home happily with all 3, one of which had roe in its belly. He couldn't resist and popped it into his mouth directly. After eating the roe, he placed the fish in a frying pan for a hearty meal of pan-fried fish. Henrik D. today planned to show everyone his luxury house. Inside, wood was neatly arranged, and stone slabs covered the floor. Above was a loft with delicate wooden flooring and a solid wood bed. A brightly colored pot of berries sat on the dining table. Meanwhile, Rasmus, who had run out of fish from the previous days, thought of a new idea. He used a large rock as a new anchor, tying it tightly with a rope and carrying it to the lake. In the dark, he tied the rock to the fishing net. As dawn broke, he eagerly set out to arrange the net. After stripping off his clothes and shoes, he waded into the lake with the rock held high. Once the net was set, he shouted with excitement. Since having the raft, Mads has been very successful. Pulling up the net, he immediately received a signal of his catch. A large fish was indeed hanging on the net. As the net was slowly pulled up, one by one, fish were placed on the grass. He counted them. 7 in total, 1 large and 6 small. He returned to the shelter, roasting the fish and warming his feet by the fire. With this meal, the island officially entered winter. Mads got up early, excited to switch into his winter clothes. He was slightly thrilled to wear his new outfit. Next, he planned to upgrade his bed, collecting many soft spruces, wrapping them in waterproof fabric and bringing them home. He then laid a moisture-proof mat on top, completing a high-grade green natural mattress. Upon waking, Henrik P. realized it was already winter. Rubbing his hands, he marveled at the unpredictability of the weather. Using a bundle of wire collected days earlier, he quickly fashioned a wall frame. He then neatly lined it with spruce branches. Although slightly hollow, it perfectly met his lighting needs. The camera shifted to Rasmus, who had actually caught a fish. He had waited too long for this moment. A few hits with a big rock, and he cheered loudly. Starving for days, he hastily prepared lunch. A bite of fish finally satisfied his long, empty stomach. Henrik D. had a tougher time, having eaten berries for 20 days straight. Needing more energy, he ventured further for food, only to find the lake had risen significantly. The stone he used to sit on was submerged, and Meta's dock was almost completely underwater. She had packed her bags early, ready to flee as soon as the tide rose. The island's winds grew stronger. Watching the huge waves hit the rocks, Rasmus knew his fishing net was likely doomed. He shouted defiantly at the wind and waves. Mads did something unusual by stripping off his clothes and jumping into the water, ending up freezing and crying. After his bath, he calmly stood in the wind, accepting the baptism. The next morning, the storm had calmed down. Henrik P. was relieved that his shelter was undamaged, but the cold in his feet, due to leaky boots, troubled him. Constantly warming his feet was only a temporary solution, which made him consider quitting the competition. This was the biggest fish Rasmus had caught. After a month of catching only a few small fish and surviving on berries, he declared that if he didn't eat protein today, he would quit. But as soon as he pulled up the net, a large fish emerged. Holding it, he became so excited he was incoherent. "Let's stew it right away," he said. Unable to resist, he peeked at the stewing fish, feeling instantly reinvigorated. Once cooked, he took the pot outside, enjoying his lunch in the sunshine. After replenishing his energy, he decided to keep the momentum going. He took the net to the other side of the lake, intending to secure it with a tree branch. However, upon returning, he found the net had already been swept into the lake. With no other option, he stripped off his clothes and went into the water again, only to be overwhelmed by the icy water. That night, a small mouse entered Meta's cabin. Meta, probably not hungry, ignored the mouse and started showing off her crafting skills. She quickly finished her project. To ease her homesickness, she began working on the house again. She hammered 2 wooden sticks into the ground to make a frame, neatly arranged more sticks inside it, and filled every gap with moss. Her wood storage shed was complete. She had previously built a rain shelter to ensure a dry wood supply during rain and snow. She went to the lake and cast a fishing line. Henrik P. gave a fish he had just caught a massage, saying it would help squeeze out the guts. As he wondered what exactly that was, the fish suddenly twisted out of his hands and escaped back into the water. Frustrated, he grabbed a stick to try and retrieve the fish, and surprisingly, managed to catch it again. Every time Henrik P. appeared, he was either drying his shoes or his feet. With his toes constantly wrapped in soaked shoes, he now felt a slight pain. To warm up his feet quickly, he arranged several logs in a row, creating a chimney shape. He tried using logs instead of bricks to make a mini version, but it was much more difficult than expected. After several failures, he had a breakthrough, sticking the logs into the mud and tying them up with a rope to form a rocket launcher shape. He then placed some coal from the fire into the chimney. Initially, there was only a flame at the bottom and no activity in the chimney part. Just as he thought it had failed again, the flames suddenly shot up, bringing a smile to his face as he looked at the stove he had long dreamed of. Fleming's socks were so wet they could wring out water. To locate the hole in his shoes, he poured lake water into them and successfully found the leaks as water seeped out. After finding the holes, he patched them up with tape. Feeling that wasn't reliable enough, he added a layer of waterproof fabric around his foot. With this double protection, he confidently set sail on his oil drum raft. However, he only caught a small fish and returned to the shelter, dejected and contemplating whether to stay or leave. Since getting the kayak, Mads had not run out of food. Excitedly measuring a large fish with his hands, he found it was over 1 meter long, enough to last him a week. To store the fish meat, he stuck spruce branches into the ground and covered them with a collected oil drum lid. By lighting a fire underneath, he could use it to smoke the fish. Meta finally caught something with her fishing line, but the constantly squirming eel made her hesitate to eat it. She hadn't eaten for several days, however, and hunger prevailed. Despite its strong vitality, Meta hit the eel several times with a stick without killing it. She then cut it open with a knife, but it kept writhing. Meta had no choice but to cut the eel into several pieces. To her surprise, each piece still moved on the cutting board, making her hesitate again. It wasn't until she fried and tasted the pieces that she exclaimed how delicious they were. On day 31, the crew came to pick up another contestant. Rasmus finally couldn't endure any longer. He said the actual competition was much harder than it appeared on TV. Rather than money, he preferred to be happy with his family. 2 days later, Henrik P. also quit the competition. His feet were unbearably cold, always soaked in the muddy swamp by the door. Even his rocket stove couldn't keep his shoes dry. After much thought, he decided to go home. Fleming, looking at the round belly of a trout, proudly said he would show everyone a special trick today. As he slowly removed the roe with his fingers, collecting it in a bowl, he went home to gather materials for smoking fish. He inserted branches into the ground to form an arched frame and topped it with fresh spruce branches. He placed the prepared fish slices on the rack and lit a fire beneath it to smoke them. Just as he finished speaking, thick smoke and flames shot up. He quickly removed the firewood, and after the fire died down, found the fish wasn't burned. Although he couldn't smoke the fish, it was still enough to fill his stomach. After some days of adjustment, Meta's fishing net finally started functioning properly today. Although the fish was small, it was a crucial catch for her championship run. With this fish, she had stored 4 in total, enough to last at least another week. Fleming, who had often returned empty-handed recently, had slightly better luck today. However, the small fish he caught was barely enough to fill the gaps between his teeth. He then dried and maintained his net before rowing to the deeper waters of the bay, thinking that in winter, nets should be placed in deeper and farther waters. Half a small fish a day was all he had for food. Clearly not enough, he decided to supplement his diet by scraping the inner bark of birch trees into a pot. Adding water, he boiled it into a hot, meaty soup, although it was a bit tough and lacked flavor. Survival Challenge Day 38. Meta was shocked when she arrived at the lake to check her catch. Losing her fishing net meant no food. Her heart sank. Back at the shelter, looking at her family's pictures, Meta cried out of frustration. But the more she thought, the less she gave up. She grabbed a stick and tried to retrieve the net from the lake. At that moment, a howl came from afar. Mads explained it was his way of greeting bears, telling them to keep their distance. Due to bears, Mads gave up his wilderness journey and relied on his fishing net again. Meta finally found the net stuck at the bottom of the lake. It ripped as she pulled with all her might. Reluctantly, she cut off the torn 2 meters and threw the rest back into the lake. That night, worried about the net, Meta couldn't sleep and went back to the lake with a headlamp. Fortunately, the net was still there and had caught a fish, giving her new hope. Mads, living in a drafty house, couldn't sleep from the cold and sang himself to sleep. Fleming, now the wealthiest, had neatly arranged 9 fishes, no longer needing to eat bark. Back in the warm shelter, fried fish was quickly on the menu. Meta also brought back 3 fish, cooking fish while warming by the fire. Her new meal plan was half a fish a day plus some berries, saving the rest for winter. After eating, she still licked her fingers. By day 40, it started raining again. To motivate herself, she carved a motto on the wall. After that, she prepared a cane as a gift for her daughter, carving her daughter's name on it. Fleming was also making gifts for his son, impressively carving a cowboy figurine. He made 2 cowboy dolls during the rain. As the competition entered the final sprint, the 3 contestants were evenly matched. Mads kept catching fish. Meta continued to bring in fish, and Fleming had a mountain of fish. Days later, on day 45, Meta recalled the hardships with tears in her eyes. Mads looked up to the sky and cried. Meanwhile, Fleming sat under his nameplate, waiting for the victory interview. On day 46, he suddenly used a satellite phone, saying he achieved his goal and could now go home. The camera turned to Mads, whose hat had a hole bitten by a rat. I made a mousetrap using a jar and placed fish meat inside as bait, then waited for the result. By night, the mouse appeared as expected and cooperatively entered the trap. Mads, quick to react, caught it immediately. However, since he couldn't skin it, he couldn't eat it and had to painfully give it to his neighbor, the termite. By day 52, everything on the Norwegian island was covered with frost, and the lake began to freeze slowly. It's unbelievable that Mads is still living in a melon shed in this weather, with his body temperature dropping to 35 degrees Celsius. If it drops further, he'll face mandatory withdrawal from the competition. At night, he could only rely on drinking hot water to keep warm. The fish Mads left outside had frozen solid, and thankfully, his knife was sharp enough to cut through them. After this meal, his food supply was low. With this little heat, he went to check his fish catch naked, only to find nothing. Meta also hadn't had a catch for 3 days. The lack of food intake made it difficult for her to even cut 2 slices, which is hard to believe. Today was her husband's birthday, and she sang a birthday song for him on the show and carved a flag on a cane to commemorate this special day. By day 53, Fleming was sunbathing and having lunch when it was time to check his nets. He was lucky to catch a fish today. Back at the shelter, he found a small mouse stealing food and, unable to contain his anger, grabbed a stick and swung at it but missed. By day 55, it started snowing, and the cold index rose again. Mads couldn't bear it any longer. Although he never lacked food, the cold nearly drove him mad. It proves that a sturdy, warm shelter is critically important. Just when Meta was at a dead end, she caught a big fish, but soon realized her predicament. Counting the days, she hadn't had her menstruation this month, a path inevitable when a woman's body fat drops to a certain level, causing irreversible damage to her body. This plunged her into confusion. Fleming also had a tough time recently, having eaten earthworms gnawed on bark and picked up discarded fish heads. Soon it was time for their routine physical examination. Both were anxious. Fleming had lost over 40 pounds and Medi had lost 30, but the doctor delivered bad news. Her body no longer had the extra energy to support her menstruation, a severe issue for women. She needed to seriously consider whether to stay or leave. Thinking of how hard she had persevered only to potentially have to withdraw due to her health, she couldn't stop her tears from flowing. The morning of the next day marked day 58 of the competition. Meta finally decided to withdraw due to the physical harm she could no longer ignore, despite her desire to win. With Meta's departure, Fleming won the competition, but the production team did not inform him. Instead, they quietly brought his family to him. Surprised by the sudden appearance of his beloved family, Fleming was overwhelmed with emotion. His wife jumped into his arms and they shared a passionate kiss. The family then embraced tightly together. His wife also brought him a basket full of food. Fleming showed his family around his dwelling, presented the gifts he had prepared for them, and expressed his longing for them. Congratulations to Fleming for winning the championship.